You're noticing that your AI answers just aren't good, even though you've got the information in your knowledge base. In fact, sometimes they're just flat out wrong. Now, you don't need magic to fix this. The key actually lies in how you structure your data. So I'm going to show you how to fix that in 4 easy steps. But before we do that, YouTube says that 78% of the people who watch this video aren't subscribed. So if you want to know how to build the most advanced AI agents in Voiceflow, hit subscribe below. Now let's dive into what you're likely doing wrong and a couple steps on how you can start to fix it. So here we've got our Voiceflow assistant, and I've gone ahead and loaded in a ton of data sources from our website to create our bot. But if I go ahead and ask it some simple questions like how much does Voiceflow cost, it gives me an answer, but this answer is actually wrong. And if I really look into it, it's because it's coming from some outdated blog post in January, like 2 years ago. If I ask it another question, like what are the steps in Voiceflow? So you would expect an answer like the button step, the text step, all the steps you use to design your flow or your assistant. And you can see here that it doesn't actually answer that either. It gives me something about user testing and drafting the design. This isn't what I'm looking for. Now, these answers aren't good, but there are a couple of ways that I can go ahead and improve them and rethink about how I'm structuring the data that's going to be informing this assistant. The first one is understanding what types of information I want to have and where I'm going to grab those from. Now, I want this to be a bot on our website. So users are going to come here, they're going to ask questions. I'm going to eventually capture their emails and try to get demos and leads. But the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I've got my core bases covered of what people are going to ask. So I know that people are going to ask about pricing. This is a big one that I want to make sure I have up-to-date information on. So let's go pricing. The second one is going to be about case studies and use cases, right? I know that some of the common questions people ask me are, what can Voiceflow do? How much support can Voiceflow automate? What is the type of AI agent that I can build on Voiceflow? So I want to add in some up-to-date case studies and maybe some relevant blog posts about some of the most recent features that we've released. Now, the third one is probably going to be the biggest bucket, which is actually going to be our support documentation. A ton of users come to our Voiceflow website and they ask questions about how Voiceflow works. Now, we want to make sure that they've got a really good source of information to get this from. So in that case, I'm going to write support docs. Now, for each of these buckets, I want to make sure that I've got up-to-date information that's being loaded into my assistant. So for my support documentation, I'm actually going to go ahead and grab these specifically from Zendesk. I may also add our developer documentation in here. This ensures that the information that people are going to be asking about is as up-to-date as our docs are. So I'm going to say import from Zendesk. Now, up-to-date case studies is going to be a bit more manual. I want to understand and look through our blog and figure out what are the specific types of blog posts that I want to include in our assistant to make sure that users have the most up-to-date information. One of the biggest hazards with importing your whole website is that you have a ton of content out there that is out of date, but the AI has no idea what's out of date or what isn't. And so that's up to you to decide what goes into there to kind of form the brain or the base of their knowledge. And the last one here is pricing. Now, pricing is super sensitive, right? You don't want to give out wrong prices. You don't want to give people misinformation. So I want to be really careful and make sure that I've got up-to-date information and that I only have one document around pricing so that I can go ahead and update it if the pricing ever changes, or that the information about pricing I know is only going to come from one unique source that I have a lot of control. My recommendation here is that when you're building your assistant for the first time, you start off with a few pieces of information. So in this case, I'm going to just start off with pricing, and then I'm going to move to the case studies and the support documentation. When you start off with a smaller number of documents in your assistant, it's easier to debug and figure out how to get the optimal responses before you go ahead and add more documentation and you get lost in a sea of information. Now we're going to go ahead and start adding the most important piece of information first, which is pricing. And now this goes into the second rule, which is to make sure that your documents are formatted appropriately. And I'm going to show you what that means. So let's get rid of all of this other information in our knowledge base here so we can start fresh. Great. Now, I'm going to start off with pricing. So I want to add in information from our pricing page. This is going to be the most up-to-date source of Voiceflow information. And so you can see here on our pricing page, we've got our actual prices, which is $50 a month for our pro plan, $500 for our teams plan, and more for our enterprise. But the first problem here is that this information isn't actually organized well for an AI to understand. Now, for a human, it's easy because I can understand that this is in a kind of table form, that these icons mean something, but AIs aren't as good as doing that. On top of that, the other thing is that the web scraper inside of Voiceflow is actually built for text documents. So it's not going to be able to recognize that on this web page, these UI elements actually indicate different parts. It's just going to scrape all the text from this page and jumble it together. So if I go ahead and try to add this page directly to the knowledge base, this isn't going to go that well. So let's add data source, URL, and import this. One way you can check is that when you actually upload a document to the knowledge base, if you click on not the URL, but this white part here, it'll open up a side panel and you can see how Voiceflow has chunked that information. So right off the bat, you can see that I've got a bunch of URLs here. This doesn't really make much sense. I'm not seeing any of the columns. And that's because a lot of the information on this page was actually in images. So they didn't get scraped by the web scraper. So if I now try to go and ask something like, how much does Voiceflow cost? It gives me an answer, but it's not actually what I want, right? It says editors have the ability to make changes. Voiceflow has different pricing plans. Check the website. That's not why I'm asking your assistant. I want the actual answer. And if I check the sources here, it's grabbing it from the pricing page, but because that document doesn't actually have any well properly formatted information in it that the AI can access, it's not able to actually answer it. So because this is really sensitive and I want to make sure this is right, this is where I can add a different data source with more information that's structured properly. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. And instead, let's add a data source that's a bit different. So in terms of the order of control that you have, so URLs and sitemap have the least control. This is using a web scraper to actually scrape the page for text, and then it tries to put it into the best way it can for formatting and uploads that to Voiceflow. An integration is pretty solid. If you're using Zendesk, this is a great one. This is actually going to pull the documents themselves from Zendesk. And because these are text documents, it's going to be formatted well. The next ones are uploaded file and plain text. Now, this is how you're going to get the most control out of your assistant. Because when you upload a PDF, you know that the documents are going to be structured properly. But really, plain text is what I'm going to go for here, because this is going to allow me to inject Q&As or specific pieces of information into my knowledge base that I can then go and modify later. So what I'm going to do here now is I'm actually going to paste in the information I have about pricing. Now, if you have a document, that's way better. I have just an example here, but ideally you have a document with a ton of detail about these different plans, the prices, any other information you want users to know that can be fed to the AI. And so I'm just going to put in a quick sample here, but Voiceflow pricing is as follows: Pro plan, Teams plan, Enterprise plan, who's it for, etc. So now if I go ahead and import this, you can see that when this is done and I click it, that the information in the chunk is actually great. This is exactly what I put in here. I have a lot of control over this. And this is the thing with adding text, is that you can actually go ahead and modify this afterwards. But this is pretty good. And now when I go ahead and start asking it questions like, how much is Voiceflow? It's going to be able to answer with a much higher degree of accuracy because it's pulling from that main source. So you can see here it was able to summarize all the different plans. And if I ask it something like, I'm a new agency with one person, what plan should I get? It's going to be able to interpret that and recommend a plan for the user. So $50 a month. So you can see here, even though I don't have a lot of information, I just got one piece of information, but it's good, high quality information. My AI model is able to understand that, interpret it, and then respond back to user questions in an efficient and accurate manner. So in the case of data sources with AI, less is more, and more is actually not that great. You want to have less higher quality sources to be able to produce higher quality answers that are just as robust as what you would expect with a large knowledge base. So you want to make sure you spend a lot of time making sure that your most sensitive information is formatted correctly. So now we've got our pricing data source in there. Let's work through those other sources that we've got over here in our diagram. So we've got our pricing now. Now let's add in some update case studies and then some support documentation. We're going to import it from Zendesk. So if I head over to the Voiceflow website, I'm going to now go to our blog and I'm going to manually pick out the documents that I want to upload. Because again, it's going to be important that I have a high level of control. So over here, I'm going to add a case study with Trilogy that automated 60% of their customer support with Voiceflow. This has got a ton of really good information in it about how they use Voiceflow, how many of their tickets they actually automated, and how they were actually able to use AI to increase the number of tickets they automated from 6 to 60% in just a few weeks. So let's go ahead and add that in. And for this one, because we know what URL it's going to come from, we're going to add in the URL. Now let's grab two more. So let's test this out now and ask something like, what can Voiceflow help me do? And you can see here that it says Voiceflow helps you automate customer support, provide accurate answer to customer questions, etc. Can you give me some examples of customers and how they used voice? Great. And it was able to actually really pull from up to date. So it says Rome, a startup in the flexible car industry, automated their sales. Trilogy, they saw 35% resolution in the first week. So it's giving us a lot of really good in-depth information here. Now I want to get the third piece, which is all of our support documentation. So this one I'm actually going to import from Zendesk. So we've got all our support documentation in Zendesk, and this is live up to date, and there is a ton of it that can really help our users. So now that we know we're getting a base of really good information, we're going to go ahead and add our support documentation in here to really make this a robust assistant. So what I'm going to do is, rather than scraping the website, I'm actually going to use the integration. Now, integrations are always best. Right now, we support Zendesk. We're going to be adding more in the future, but you can actually use Knowledge Base API to upload documents as well. So if you have a content system somewhere, that's going to be much more accurate to be able to import it. And I'll show you why. So I've authenticated, and let's add all our docs. So we're going to add the Voiceflow docs. We're going to add English. We don't have any user segments. That's fine. And we'll add our guides and our documentation. So this is going to add 136 data sources here. So now you can see that it's starting to add a ton of information in here, but because I'm adding these in pieces as I'm testing it out, I have a really good sense that I know my base information is good, and now it's about the Zendesk ones. So if I go ahead and click on something, you can see that the chunks are actually pretty good. So if I go ahead and now ask it something like, what are all the steps in Voiceflow? This gives me a much better answer than what I originally got. This is a great answer. And I'm pretty satisfied now knowing that my voice assistant can answer any question about Voiceflow. It can also answer case studies and business information, as well as the really sensitive information about pricing. Now we're going to get into point number 3, which is what you can start doing after you've filled out the base of your assistant, which is to start injecting frequently asked questions into your knowledge base. Sometimes there are questions you get that you want to give a specific answer to, and you want this to be high quality, similar to pricing, but it may be related to other services, refunds, things like that you know are pretty sensitive pieces of information that you want to have the right answers to. So let's say I've got a question like, does Voiceflow process refunds? So let's see what it says right now. And it says, yes, Voiceflow does process refunds. Customers support a refund by emailing support@voiceflow.com. And if I check here, it looks like this is mentioned in some of my help articles. But let's say I wanted to provide more information to this. So I'm going to inject an FAQ into the database. And the way that it works is when you actually ask a question to the Voiceflow knowledge base, it's looking through all of these different chunks and it's returning what it thinks is the most relevant. So you saw in that last example, when I asked a question about refunds, it returned 3 chunks. One of them had a slight mention of refunds. The other ones didn't, but I thought it might be relevant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a data source and I'm just going to add plain text. Now, we're going to have an entire built-out solution for FAQs coming out in the near future. So if you're watching this a couple months from release and we've got a whole new section here about FAQs, you can ignore this. But if you're not, this is also a great way to kind of add in or inject manual overrides into your knowledge base. So I'm going to put a question in here. So I'm going to say question, or maybe Q, is does Voiceflow offer refunds? Does Voiceflow give out refunds? And now I'm just going to add in my own answer. Voiceflow only processes refunds in specific cases. Please reach out to support@voiceflow.com if you require a refund. Great. So let's import this in here. And so now I've got something a bit more specific. So if I now ask it again, does Voiceflow offer refunds? You'll notice that now it says Voiceflow only processes refunds in specific cases. Please reach out to voiceflow.com if you require a refund. And if I look at the chunks, that's because the first one it's surfacing, that's the most important, is the Q&A that I added in there. Because I added a piece of information to the knowledge base that's highly relevant to this topic area, it's going to surface this first, and it's most likely just going to use the information from here, and it'll look at the other ones just to see if there's anything that it might be related to. So you can see it gave in my thing about pricing here, and it has this document here about downgrading and cancellation. So this is how you can inject an FAQ into your knowledge base to have it have a higher degree of answering accurately for that question. Now we're getting into tip number 4, which is really about modifying your knowledge base settings. So you've gotten hints at how the knowledge base works here about retrieving and providing chunks. And you can find more information into the details of how vector databases work in general in the links below in our YouTube channel. But let's go into some settings that you can tweak to try and get better or more accurate responses. Within your Voiceflow knowledge base, you have these settings here. So these are the global settings that are kind of like the foundation of your assistant. Now, if you open these up, there's a couple of different things. So there's the AI model. So we've got a bunch here. We're adding way more in the future. We've got the temperature. So this is going to control the randomness of the answer that the large language model provides. If you're okay with your answers being a little bit more flexible, you can increase the temperature here. If you want them to be pretty standard, from someone asks the same question 3 times, you want the same answer, In the same way, you can reduce this down to be very deterministic. I'm okay. I want it to be a bit deterministic, so I'm going to have it be 0.1. Max tokens are also important. This is the max output tokens. So this is the number of tokens that can be used to generate a single response. So if I have this at 128, that's going to kind of snip my answers at 128, but it'll also be a bit shorter. Just to be safe, I'm going to increase this to maybe 200, just to make sure that the AI has enough room to be able to communicate an answer. Now, the last one here that's very important is the chunk limit. So if you remember when we asked a question, there are certain sources that are passed back to the knowledge base, these chunks on the side here. This is going to dictate how many chunks it should pass to the large language model to determine an answer from. The more chunks you have, the more information the large language has to work with, but the more chance that it might actually mix up conflicting pieces of information and give the user a wrong answer. So a large number of chunks works really well when you have a knowledge base that you know is really consistent and high quality. You're going to pass information over, and the large language model is going to look at all 8 of these different chunks of information and assemble an answer. Now, the more chunks you use, the more tokens it's going to cost. You can imagine that 10 chunks is like 10 of these gigantic pieces here being sent to the AI. It's going to use a lot of tokens. May not always be best. On the other hand, if you use one chunk, so you lower it down, the AI model will only have one chunk to go from. And so if you have relevant information in a couple pieces, it's not going to see that. It'll just see one. But on the good side here, it's only seeing the most relevant chunk. So this is a good one if you want to make sure that your answers are very highly accurate. You may have more cases where an answer isn't found because the answer wasn't necessarily in the first chunk that was passed. But for the most part, you're going to have much more accuracy on your answers. And so that's what this chunk limit is. The default here is 3. I like to keep it at 3 or 2. It's a good balance between accuracy and the number of tokens. The last thing here is system prompt. This is passed to the AI model as more of like a general set of instructions. So this is great to enter a persona and even things like keep your answers brief or answer the questions as detailed as possible and provide a lot of information. So those are the 4 steps. Let's go ahead and wrap this up and actually try out some of those original queries on our new and improved Voiceflow knowledge base bot. How much is Voiceflow? And you're going to see that we've got answers that are much more accurate and up to date. What are all the steps? Great. And done. Now you have a much better idea of how to use a knowledge base in Voiceflow and how to get better AI answers by better structuring your data. That's it. My name is Daniel. I'm the head of growth at Voiceflow. And if you have any other questions, feel free to hop into our Discord, leave a question in the comments, or hit us up on any of our socials. If not, we'll see you in Discord and on Voiceflow, and happy building.